The silent frontier, when words failed and trust was all that remained. The silent frontier, when words failed and trust was all that remained. The bullet tore through the saloon window 3 inches from Jake Coleman's head. Glass exploded across the poker table as he dove sideways, his chair clattering to the floor. The other players scattered like startled crows, but Jake's eyes locked on the gunman across the street, a shadow disappearing behind the general store. His hand went to his holster, fingers wrapping around cold steel, but he stopped himself. 5 years ago, he would have returned fire without thinking. 5 years ago, he could still hear. The total silence that had become his world made everything sharper and more dangerous. He couldn't hear footsteps approaching from behind or voices calling warnings. In the frontier town of Copper Ridge, that silence was a death sentence waiting to happen. Jake rolled behind the overturned table, scanning the room through the settling dust. The bartender's mouth moved frantically, probably shouting for everyone to get down, but Jake heard nothing. He read the terror in the man's eyes instead. Another window shattered, then another. Someone was trying to flush him out, and they were doing a thorough job of it. Jake counted the shots by watching the impacts, by feeling the vibrations through the floorboards. 6 rounds the shooter would need to reload. That gave him maybe 10 seconds. He burst through the back door into the alley, his boots hitting dirt he couldn't hear strike. The afternoon sun blinded him momentarily. A hand grabbed his shoulder and Jake spun, his gun halfway drawn before he recognized Lucy Martinez. The blacksmith's daughter had been teaching him to read lips for the past 3 months, ever since he'd ridden into Copper Ridge with a fever that had stolen his hearing. Her brown eyes were wide with urgency, and her lips formed words he fought to understand. Danger. Riders. Coming. How many? He signed back with his hands, using the simple signals they'd developed together. She held up 7 fingers, then pointed north toward the canyon road. 7 men hunting one deaf gunslinger. The odds would have been bad even when he could hear. Now they seemed impossible. But Jake had learned something in his months of silence. He'd learned to see things other men missed. The slight movement of fabric that meant someone was breathing behind cover. The way dust settled after boots disturbed it. The telltale shift of a horse's weight before its rider drew a weapon. His other senses had grown razor-sharp to compensate for what he'd lost. Lucy pulled him toward the stable, moving fast. Her father, Pedro, stood in the doorway, a rifle in his weathered hands. The old blacksmith nodded once at Jake, a gesture of respect between men who understood violence. Pedro had lost his voice to a mining accident years ago. He and Jake had formed a strange friendship built on silence and hand signals. Now that friendship might be the only thing keeping Jake alive. The stable smelled of hay and horse sweat. Jake's stallion, a gray beast named Ash, stamped nervously in his stall. Animals could sense danger even when they couldn't see it yet. Jake moved to saddle the horse, but Pedro stopped him, shaking his head firmly. The blacksmith pointed to the loft above, then made a gesture Jake had learned meant hide. Lucy was already climbing the ladder, beckoning him to follow. From the loft window, Jake had a clear view of Main Street. 6 riders emerged from the heat shimmer at the north end of town, moving in formation like military men. They wore dusty trail clothes, but their movements were too coordinated for common outlaws. The 7th man, the one who'd fired through the saloon window, stepped out from behind the general store to join them. Their leader sat a black horse, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face Jake recognized even at this distance. Clay Dawson. A bounty hunter with a reputation for never leaving a job unfinished. Jake's hand touched the wanted poster folded in his vest pocket. He'd been carrying it for 2 weeks, ever since he'd seen it tacked to a post office wall. $5,000 for Jake Coleman, wanted for murder in Kansas. The charge was false. He had been defending a ranch family from claim jumpers, but the claim jumpers had friends in high places, friends who could afford to put a price on his head that would bring every hunter between here and the Mississippi. Lucy knelt beside him at the window, her fingers touching his arm gently. She pointed at the riders, then at him, then drew her finger across her throat. They would kill him if they found him. He nodded. He'd known that from the moment the first bullet flew. But something in Lucy's eyes told him she wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. She reached into her apron and pulled out a small notebook and pencil, writing quickly. Her handwriting was neat despite her hurry. They think you are alone. They do not know about us. We help you. Below, Clay Dawson dismounted and began giving orders Jake couldn't hear. Men spread out, checking buildings systematically. They were professionals doing professional work. 2 headed toward the stable. Jake felt his pulse quicken. Pedro was down there alone. The blacksmith couldn't shout for help even if he wanted to. Jake started toward the ladder, but Lucy grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. She shook her head firmly and wrote again. Papa knows what to do. Trust him. Trust was the hardest thing Jake had learned in his silent world. He'd spent 5 years relying only on himself, convinced that asking for help was the same as admitting weakness. But Copper Ridge had taught him different. Pedro and Lucy had welcomed him when other towns had chased him away. They'd seen past the disability to the man underneath. Now they were risking their lives for him, and all they asked in return was that he trust them enough to let them help. The stable doors opened below. Jake watched through the gaps in the floorboards as Pedro stood his ground, the rifle hanging loosely at his side. The 2 bounty hunters approached cautiously. One of them was talking, his mouth moving in demands Pedro couldn't answer even if he wanted to. The blacksmith simply stared at them, his face blank and unhelpful. Jake had seen that look before. Pedro was playing the part of a simple man too stupid or too scared to be useful. One of the hunters grabbed Pedro's shirt, shaking him roughly. Jake's hand went to his gun again, anger rising hot in his chest. But Pedro didn't resist. He just pointed vaguely toward the south, toward the desert that stretched for miles beyond town. The hunter released him with obvious disgust, saying something to his partner. They turned to search the stable, poking through stalls and checking corners. They looked everywhere except up. Jake barely breathed as the men passed directly beneath the loft. One of them stood so close that Jake could have dropped a rock on his head. But the hunter never looked up, never thought to check the shadows above. After what felt like an hour but was probably 5 minutes, they gave up and walked back outside. Through the window, Jake watched them report to Clay Dawson, shaking their heads. The bounty hunter's face darkened with frustration. Lucy touched Jake's shoulder and showed him a new message in her notebook. Then they will ride south like Papa told them. We must move you before then. Tonight, when dark comes, we take you to the canyon. There is a place there only I know. You can hide until they give up and leave. Jake wanted to argue that he should face them head on, that running was cowardice. But he'd learned enough about survival to know that pride got men killed. 7 against 1 was suicide, deaf or not. He nodded his agreement. Lucy smiled, a quick flash of relief crossing her face. She wrote one more line. You are not alone anymore, Jake Coleman. Remember that. The afternoon crawled past with agonizing slowness. Jake watched from the loft as Clay Dawson's men tore through Copper Ridge like a tornado. They questioned everyone, searched everything, and grew increasingly angry when their prey remained hidden. Twice they returned to the stable, and twice Pedro's blank face and unhelpful gestures sent them away. The blacksmith was a better actor than most theater performers. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jake could see but not hear being praised. Lucy brought him water and dried meat. She'd also brought a map, hand-drawn on butcher paper. Her finger traced a route from the stable through the back alleys of town, then up into the rocky hills where the canyon began. There was a cave marked with an X, and beside it she'd written, Water, Supplies, Safe. She'd been planning this, preparing for the moment when Jake's past would catch up to him. He looked at her in the dying light, this young woman who owed him nothing but had chosen to risk everything. Why he signed? Why help me when it puts you in danger? Lucy didn't need to write her answer. She placed her hand over her heart, then pointed at him, then gestured to the town below. Because you are one of us now. Because in Copper Ridge we protect our own. 'Cause silence does not make a man worthless, and neither does being hunted for crimes he did not commit. Jake felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he'd built to keep people out. For 5 years he'd been running, convinced that his deafness made him a burden no community would want to carry. But Lucy and Pedro had shown him different. They'd shown him that strength came in many forms, and sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was accept help from those who offered it freely. As darkness fell over Copper Ridge, Jake prepared to move. He checked his gun, tightened his boots, and made peace with the fact that he might not survive the night. Clay Dawson wasn't the type to give up easily, and $5,000 was enough money to make men persistent. But for the first time in a long while, Jake wasn't facing danger alone. He had allies. He had a plan. And most importantly, he had something worth surviving for beyond simple revenge or clearing his name. He had a place where people saw him as more than his disability, more than a wanted man. He had a home worth fighting to return to. Lucy extinguished the lamp, plunging the loft into darkness. Below, Pedro opened the back door of the stable silently. The night waited, full of danger and possibility in equal measure. Jake touched the brim of his hat in silent thanks to the 2 people who'd given him something he thought he'd lost forever. Hope. Then he descended the ladder into the dark, ready to face whatever came next. His world was silent, but it was far from empty, and that made all the difference. The night air hit Jake's face like a cool cloth as he slipped from the stable into the narrow alley behind. Lucy moved ahead of him, her dark dress blending with the shadows. She knew these paths like the lines on her own palm. Pedro stayed behind, closing the door softly and returning to his forge where the bounty hunters could see him working, providing an alibi if questions came. The plan was simple. Simple plans had the best chance of working. Jake followed Lucy's lead, staying close to the buildings, using the darkness and his newfound skills of observation. He could see the orange glow of cigarettes where two of Dawson's men stood guard at the corner of the street. Their attention was focused on the main road, not the back alleys where rats and stray dogs roamed. Lucy paused at each intersection, checking both ways before waving him forward. They moved like ghosts through a town that had gone quiet under the occupation of armed strangers. 3 blocks from the stable, Lucy stopped abruptly. Jake nearly ran into her back. She pressed herself against the wall of the mercantile, and he did the same. A shadow moved across the alley ahead. One of the bounty hunters was making rounds, checking the back ways. Jake's hand moved to his gun, but Lucy caught his wrist. She shook her head firmly. No shooting. Shooting would bring all 7 men running, and their escape would end before it began. The hunter walked closer, his boots scuffing on the packed dirt. Jake could see the man's face now in the moonlight, young and hard, probably no older than 25. This wasn't his first hunt. The way he moved spoke of experience and training. His hand rested on his holster, ready but not drawn. He was careful. Careful men live longer in this business. The hunter stopped 10 feet from where they hid, looking left and right, scanning the shadows. Jake held his breath. Lucy had pressed herself so flat against the wall that she seemed to become part of it. The hunter's gaze swept over them, across them, moved past them. In the darkness, 2 motionless figures looked like nothing more than irregularities in the building's shadow. The hunter spat into the dirt, apparently satisfied with his patrol, and continued walking. He disappeared around the next corner. Lucy counted to 30 on her fingers, then motioned for Jake to follow. They crossed the alley quickly, moving into the residential section of town where small houses clustered together like sleeping animals. Dogs would be the danger here. Dogs could hear and smell what men in the dark could not see. But Lucy had thought of that too. At each house, she tossed small pieces of jerky from her apron pockets. The dogs caught the treats and settled back down, their loyalty bought cheaply but effectively. Jake found himself impressed by her thoroughness. The edge of town approached faster than Jake expected. Beyond the last row of houses, the land sloped upward into rocky hills dotted with juniper and sage. The canyon lay another mile beyond, a crack in the earth where water had carved through stone over countless years. It was rough country, the kind of place where a man could hide for weeks if he knew the land. Lucy clearly knew it well. They climbed the first rise, leaving the lights of Copper Ridge behind. Jake looked back once and saw the town spread below like a collection of fireflies in the dark. Somewhere down there, Clay Dawson was planning his next move, probably assuming his prey was still hiding in town. By the time the bounty hunter realized Jake had slipped away, they'd have hours of head start, maybe enough to make a real escape possible. Lucy led him along a path that wasn't really a path, more a suggestion of easier walking through the rocks and brush. She moved with confidence even in near total darkness, her feet finding purchase where Jake could barely see the ground. They climbed for what felt like an hour but might have been less. Time had a strange quality in the silent dark. Without sound to mark its passage, Jake relied on the position of the stars and the growing ache in his legs. The canyon appeared suddenly, a black gash in the earth that opened before them like a giant's mouth. Lucy stopped at the rim and lit a small lantern she'd been carrying. The light was feeble but enough to see by. She pointed down a narrow trail that switched back along the canyon wall. Jake peered over the edge and saw nothing but darkness below. He'd have to trust that the path went somewhere safe and that Lucy knew where she was leading him. The descent was treacherous. Loose rocks skittered away under Jake's boots, tumbling down into the depths. He couldn't hear them hit bottom, couldn't judge how far they fell. Each step required faith that the ground would hold. Lucy moved ahead of him, the lantern swinging gently, casting wild shadows on the canyon walls. Twice Jake's foot slipped and he caught himself on the rock face, his heart hammering. But Lucy never faltered, never showed doubt. At the bottom of the canyon, a thin stream reflected starlight. Lucy followed it upstream, stepping from rock to avoid leaving tracks in the sandy banks. Smart girl. Even if Dawson's men found the canyon, they'd have a hard time following a trail that didn't exist. The walls rose high on either side now, cutting off the sky until only a ribbon of stars showed above. This deep in the earth, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. Jake was grateful for his jacket. They rounded a bend and Lucy stopped before a dark opening in the canyon wall. The cave was invisible until you were nearly on top of it, hidden behind a tumble of boulders that looked natural but had clearly been arranged. She squeezed through a gap and motioned for Jake to follow. Inside, the cave opened into a space large enough to stand upright. Lucy set the lantern on a flat rock and showed Jake what she'd prepared. Supplies lined one wall. Blankets, food, water in sealed canteens, matches, a small cookpot, even ammunition for Jake's pistol. How long had she been stockpiling these things? How long had she known this day would come? She saw his question in his eyes and pulled out a notebook. I knew men like Dawson would come eventually. You are too good a man to have no enemies. Good men make enemies of bad men simply by existing. Jake sat heavily on the cave floor, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had kept him moving was draining away, leaving behind bone-deep weariness. Lucy handed him a canteen and he drank gratefully. The water was cold and sweet, probably from a spring higher up in the mountains. She wrote again while he drank. You can stay here safely for days, maybe weeks. I will bring more supplies when I can. Papa and I will tell Dawson's men that you rode south at sunset. They will chase a ghost into the desert. But Jake was shaking his head before she finished writing. He took the pencil from her hand and wrote his own message. Too dangerous for you. If they catch you helping me, Dawson will make an example. I won't put you and Pedro at risk. I'll wait 2 days, then move on. Dies. Another town. Another life. Same as always. Lucy's eyes flashed with anger. She wrote furiously, her pencil nearly tearing the paper. Running is not living. Running is dying slowly. You found a place here. People who see you, not your disability. Are you going to throw that away because you were afraid of endangering us?
We are already in danger. The frontier is danger.
Every day is danger. At least let us choose who we face that danger for. Her words hit harder than any bullet. Jake stared at the notebook, reading her message twice, 3 times. She was right. He'd been running for 5 years, telling himself he was protecting people by staying distant, by never putting down roots. But maybe he'd just been protecting himself from the pain of losing another home. The fever that took his hearing had taken his old life too. His job as a ranch foreman, his friends, his future, he'd lost everything in one burning week of delirium. Since then, he'd been a ghost, passing through towns without leaving a mark. Copper Ridge had been different. Pedro and Lucy had marked him. They'd carved a place for him in their lives, made space for a deaf gunslinger who communicated in hand signs and careful lip reading. They'd given him dignity when the world tried to strip it away. And now Lucy was telling him that dignity meant letting people help, meant trusting others to share the burden of his troubles. He wrote slowly, choosing words carefully. If I stay, Dawson will burn this town looking for me. People will get hurt. How can I live with that? Lucy read his words and smiled, sad and knowing. She wrote back, If you run, you hurt us anyway. You take away our choice. You make our help meaningless. Trust us, Jake. Trust that we know the risks and choose to take them anyway. Trust that you are worth it. Outside the cave, the night deepened. Somewhere in Copper Ridge, Clay Dawson was probably tearing apart the town, growing more frustrated with each empty building. By dawn, he'd know his quarry had escaped. He'd send riders in all directions, searching for tracks, for witnesses, for any sign of where Jake had gone. Lucy's false trail pointing south might buy a day or two. But Dawson was smart. He'd figure it out eventually. Jake made his decision. He would stay in the cave for 3 days, long enough to see how Dawson reacted, long enough to make a plan that didn't involve running blind into the wilderness. If the bounty hunter left Copper Ridge, Jake would return to town. If Dawson stayed and proved he meant to dig in for a long hunt, then Jake would lead him away, pull the danger away from the people he'd come to care about. Either way, he was done making decisions alone. He told Lucy his thoughts, writing them out in the notebook they passed back and forth. She nodded approval. 3 days was reasonable. 3 days gave them time to learn Dawson's intentions, time to prepare for whatever came next. She stood, brushing dust from her dress. The lantern light made her shadow dance across the cave walls. She pointed to herself, then to the cave entrance, then held up one finger. She'd return in 1 day with news and more supplies. Jake stood too, suddenly not wanting her to leave. The cave felt safer with 2 people in it. But he knew she had to go back. Her absence would be noticed. Questions would be asked. She needed to be seen in town, going about her normal life, giving no hint that she was harboring a wanted man. He walked her to the entrance, squeezing through the gap in the boulders to stand under the stars one more time. Even without the lantern, he could see her clearly in the moonlight. She was beautiful in a way he'd never let himself notice before, strong and certain and utterly fearless. She reached up and touched his face, her palm against his cheek. He couldn't hear what she said next, but he didn't need to. Her lips formed 3 words he understood perfectly. "Come back safe." Then she was gone, moving down the canyon with the lantern, its light growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared around the bend. Jake stood alone in the dark for a long time, feeling the silence press around him like a physical weight. But it was a different silence now. Not the empty void of isolation, but the quiet of a man with something to return to. Someone waiting for him. That changed everything. He went back into the cave and arranged his bedroll on the smoothest patch of ground. The supplies Lucy had gathered showed her attention to detail. She'd included a small book, probably knowing he'd need something to occupy his mind during the long waiting. He opened it by the light of a candle he lit from the lantern she'd left behind. It was a collection of frontier tales, adventure stories about cowboys and outlaws and the wild places beyond civilization. Jake smiled. He was living one of those stories now. The deaf gunslinger, the beautiful blacksmith's daughter, the relentless bounty hunter. If it were fiction, the hero would face impossible odds and triumph through courage and skill. But Jake knew real life was messier than stories. Real life had no guarantees of happy endings. Real life could kill you just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, for making one small mistake, for trusting the wrong person or failing to trust the right one. He read until the candle burned low, then extinguished it to save resources. In the complete darkness of the cave, Jake lay on his bedroll and thought about the turns his life had taken. 5 years ago, he'd been a different man, confident and capable, his hearing sharp, his future clear. Then fever had rewritten everything. He'd lost himself for a while, drowning in bitterness and self-pity. The silence had seemed like a curse, a cosmic joke played at his expense. But maybe it wasn't a curse. Maybe it was just a different way of existing, one that required new skills and new perspectives. Jake had learned to read people in ways hearing folks never bothered with. He noticed the tiny details they missed, the way a man's eye twitched when he lied, the tension in shoulders that meant violence was coming. The genuine warmth of a smile versus the fake pleasantry of social obligation. His silence had made him a better judge of character because he couldn't rely on words alone. Lucy had seen that in him. She'd recognized that his disability didn't diminish him, just made him different. Pedro, too. The blacksmith understood that silence could be a language of its own, rich with meaning for those who learned to speak it. Together they'd created a small community of the voiceless, the misunderstood, the outcasts, who'd found each other in a place called Copper Ridge. Jake closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Tomorrow he'd plan. Tonight he'd rest. The cave was surprisingly comfortable, the temperature steady, the ground softer than many hotel beds he'd paid for over the years. He felt safe here in a way he hadn't felt safe in a long time. Safe not because he was hidden, but because people knew where he was and were watching over him. That was the real difference Lucy had shown him. Safety wasn't about being alone and invisible. Safety was about having people who cared whether you lived or died. Sleep came eventually, dreamless and deep. Jake woke to pale light filtering through the cave entrance, dawn breaking over the canyon rim high above. He ate a cold breakfast of jerky and hardtack, drank water from the canteen, and checked his weapons. The pistol was clean and well-maintained. He had 40 rounds of ammunition. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but enough to make a good accounting of himself if it came to that. The day passed slowly. Jake explored the cave, finding it went back farther than he'd realized. A narrow passage led to a second chamber with a small pool of clear water fed by an underground spring. This was where Lucy's canteens were filled. The water was icy cold and tasted faintly of minerals. Jake refilled his canteen and drank deeply. He was lucky to have found this place, luckier still to have friends who knew it existed. By afternoon, restlessness set in. Jake was a man of action, not comfortable with sitting idle while others fought his battles. He stood at the cave entrance, hidden behind the boulders, and watched the canyon. Nothing moved except wind stirring the sage and the occasional bird gliding overhead. He couldn't hear the bird calls, but he could see their grace and freedom. They made him think of escape, of flying away from all his troubles. But birds had it easy. They didn't have friends to protect or debts to repay. Evening came with a brilliant sunset that painted the canyon walls in shades of red and gold. Jake sat at the entrance and watched the light show, appreciating the beauty of a world that didn't need sound to be magnificent. As darkness fell, he saw a light moving down in the canyon. Lucy was returning right on schedule. He felt his spirits lift at the sight of her lantern bobbing along the stream bed. She climbed the cave and squeezed through the boulder gap, slightly out of breath from the climb. Her face was serious. Jake knew before she started writing that the news wasn't good. She pulled out her notebook and wrote quickly. Dawson did not believe Papa's lie. He has split his men. 3 rode south to check the trail, 4 stayed in town. He is watching everyone, asking questions. He knows someone helped you escape. He is looking for who? Jake felt cold dread settle in his stomach. This was what he'd feared. Dawson was smart enough to know that a deaf man couldn't have disappeared so completely without help. He'd be watching Pedro and Lucy especially, knowing they'd befriended the stranger. If he caught them bringing supplies to the canyon, it would be over. For all of them. He took the pencil. You can't come back here. Too dangerous. I have enough supplies for a week. I'll leave at the end of 3 days like we planned. Head east, far from here. You and Pedro will be safe once I'm gone. Lucy shook her head violently. She wrote with angry strokes. You do not understand. Dawson will not leave until he finds you, or proof you are gone. If you run east, he will hear about it eventually. Someone will see you, talk about the deaf cowboy passing through. Word will get back. He will know we lied. He will punish us for helping you escape. The only way to keep us safe is to finish this. Finish this. Jake understood what she meant. Face Dawson. End the hunt one way or another. It was what part of him had wanted all along. The part that was tired of running, tired of looking over his shoulder. But facing Dawson meant facing 7 men. Even if 3 were gone chasing false trails, 4 were too many for 1 man to handle. The odds were suicide. He wrote as much. Lucy read his words and wrote back immediately. You will not face them alone. Papa and I will help. Others in town will help too. The baker, the saloon owner, the old retired marshal who lives above the barber shop. People are angry that Dawson treats our town like his personal prison. They want him gone as much as you do. If you give them a reason to fight, they will fight. Jake stared at the notebook. She was proposing a war. A small town against professional bounty hunters. People would die. Innocent people who'd done nothing wrong except show kindness to a stranger. How could he ask them to take that risk? How could he live with himself if Lucy or Pedro or any of the others got killed fighting his battle? But Lucy's next words stopped his protest before he could write them. This is not just your battle anymore. Dawson makes it everyone's battle by occupying our town, by threatening our people. You give us the chance to stand up for ourselves, to say that Copper Ridge belongs to us, not to whoever has the most guns. That is worth fighting for. You are worth fighting for. Jake felt tears prick his eyes, the first he'd shed since the fever took his hearing. For 5 years he'd told himself he was worthless, a broken thing no one would want around. But Lucy kept insisting otherwise. She kept seeing value where he saw only deficiency. Maybe it was time he started seeing what she saw. Maybe it was time he stopped running from the man he used to be and started fighting to become someone better. He wrote 1 word. How? Lucy smiled, fierce and determined. She wrote out her plan, a strategy she'd clearly been developing since before Jake ever came to her town. It was bold. It was dangerous. It relied on timing and luck and the courage of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. But it just might work, and if it didn't, at least they'd go down fighting for something that mattered. For each other. For their town. For the idea that one man's trouble was everyone's burden when that man had proven himself worthy of help. They spent the next hour refining the plan, writing back and forth in the notebook until every detail was settled. Lucy would return to town and quietly spread word among the trusted few. Jake would stay hidden 1 more day while preparations were made. Then, on the 3rd day, at noon when the sun was highest and shadows were shortest, they would make their move. Either Clay Dawson would leave Copper Ridge in defeat, or he'd leave in a pine box. There was no middle ground anymore. Lucy stood to leave, gathering her things. Jake stopped her with a hand on her arm. He pulled out the pencil and wrote carefully, making sure every word was clear. Thank you for seeing me when I could not see myself, for trusting me when I had forgotten how to trust, for reminding me that silence is not the same as being voiceless. Whatever happens, you gave me something I thought I had lost. You gave me a reason to stop running. She read his words slowly, then looked up at him with tears in her eyes. She didn't write a response. Instead, she pulled him into a fierce hug, her arms tight around his chest, her face pressed against his shoulder. Jake held her, feeling her heartbeat against his ribs, feeling the solid reality of another person who cared whether he lived or died. It was better than any words she could have written. When she pulled away, her eyes were dry again, determined. She touched his face once more, a gesture that was becoming familiar. Then she slipped through the cave entrance and was gone, her lantern disappearing down the canyon. Jake watched until the light was completely gone, then went back inside to prepare. Tomorrow would be spent checking weapons, gathering courage and making peace with the possibility that he might not see another sunset. But tonight he was content. Tonight he knew he wasn't alone. The second day in the cave passed like a lifetime compressed into hours. Jake cleaned his pistol 3 times, checked his ammunition again and again, and paced the narrow confines like a caged animal. Waiting was harder than action. Action gave him something to focus on, something to do with his hands and his mind. Waiting just gave him time to imagine all the ways the plan could go wrong. What if Dawson's men caught Lucy spreading word of the uprising? What if the townspeople backed out at the last minute, too afraid to face professional killers? What if Jake's disability slowed him down at a critical moment, got someone killed because he couldn't hear a warning shout? The question circled his mind like vultures, picking at his confidence, feeding on his doubt. By afternoon, Jake forced himself to stop. Doubt was poison. Doubt would get him killed faster than any bullet. He'd survived 5 years on the frontier as a deaf man. That took skill and intelligence and sheer stubborn refusal to quit. Those qualities hadn't disappeared. He was still the same man who'd faced down claim jumpers in Kansas. Still the same man who'd once held off a gang of rustlers for 3 days until help arrived. His ears didn't work anymore, but his eyes were sharp, his hands steady, and his will unbroken. He took out the book Lucy had left and read more frontier tales. The heroes in these stories never had easy paths. They faced impossible odds, made hard choices, lost people they loved. But they kept moving forward anyway, driven by some inner code that said, a man stands for what's right, even when standing means falling. Jake had lost touch with that code somewhere in his journey. The fever had taken more than his hearing. It had taken his sense of purpose, his belief that he mattered beyond simple survival. Copper Ridge had given that back to him. Lucy and Pedro and the others had shown him that mattering wasn't about being perfect or whole or traditionally capable. Mattering was about choosing to contribute what you could, about accepting help when offered and offering it in return. It was about being part of something larger than yourself. Jake had been so focused on his limitations that he'd forgotten his strengths. Time to remember. As the sun set on his second day in the cave, Jake organized everything he'd need for tomorrow. The pistol and ammunition belt, a spare knife in his boot. Lucy had brought him a clean shirt and vest, understanding that if he was going to face Dawson, he should do it looking like a man who still had dignity. He laid out the clothes carefully, preparing as if for church or a wedding. Which was fitting. Tomorrow would be a ceremony of sorts.
A baptism by fire.
He'd either be reborn into a new life where Copper Ridge was truly home, or he'd die knowing he'd stopped running. Night fell and Jake slept surprisingly well. Maybe because he'd made peace with whatever was coming. Maybe because exhaustion finally overcame anxiety. He dreamed of hearing again, of sounds flooding back in a rush of sensation. Bird songs and wind through trees, and Lucy's voice saying his name. He woke with tears on his face, and the knowledge that even if some miracle restored his hearing tomorrow, he'd never forget the lessons silence had taught him. Dawn of the third day arrived clear and bright. Jake ate a good breakfast, drank deeply from the canteen, and dressed in the clean clothes. He strapped on his gun belt and checked the pistol one final time. Every chamber loaded, every mechanism working smoothly. The weapon was ready, now he just had to be ready too. He left the cave at mid-morning, giving himself time to reach the canyon rim before noon. The climb was easier going up than coming down had been, though his legs protested the steep angle. At the top, he paused to catch his breath and look back at the canyon. It was a beautiful place, harsh but honest. The kind of country that killed the weak and forged the strong. Jake had been weak when he arrived in Copper Ridge. He'd been running from himself as much as from bounty hunters. But the town and its people had begun forging him into something stronger. The walk back to Copper Ridge took less time than the journey out had taken in darkness. Jake moved quickly, confidently, following the path Lucy had shown him. He saw no one. The land was empty under the midday sun, heat shimmering off the rocks. Good. The fewer witnesses to what was coming, the better. He circled around town to approach from the east, the direction no one would expect. The buildings of Copper Ridge appeared gradually, small and temporary looking against the massive landscape. How many frontier towns like this had come and gone, founded with hope and abandoned when the hope ran out? But some survived. Some found reasons to persist beyond mere economics. Copper Ridge was trying to be one of those. Jake was going to help it succeed or die trying. He slipped between buildings, moving toward the center of town where Lucy said Dawson had set up his headquarters in the hotel. The street was nearly empty. Everyone who mattered was in position. The baker in his shop with a shotgun under the counter, the saloon owner on his roof with a rifle. the retired marshal at his window overlooking Main Street, and Pedro in his stable with the doors open and a clear line of sight to the hotel. Lucy was supposed to be safe inside her father's shop, but Jake spotted her immediately on the opposite side of the street. She'd positioned herself where she could see the hotel entrance and Jake's approach. Their eyes met across the distance. She nodded once. Everyone was ready. It was noon, or close enough. Time to finish this. Jake stepped into the street, walking slowly toward the hotel. The sun beat down from directly overhead, eliminating shadows. His boots raised small puffs of dust with each step. He felt strangely calm, almost peaceful. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine everything. His future, Lucy's future, the town's future. All of it balanced on the edge of a knife, waiting to tip one direction or another. The hotel door opened and Clay Dawson stepped out, alone. The bounty hunter was even bigger up close than he'd appeared from the stable loft. 6.5 feet tall, broad through the chest and shoulders, with a face that had seen its share of violence. His gun belt sat low on his hips, the holster worn smooth from years of practice draws. This was a man who'd killed before and would kill again without hesitation. Dawson stopped at the edge of the boardwalk, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Jake. His lips moved, probably saying something meant to be threatening or intimidating. Jake couldn't hear it and didn't care. He kept walking until 20 feet separated them, close enough to be dangerous, far enough to have a chance. The bounty hunter's mouth moved again. Jake read the question on his lips. "Are you really that stupid, coming here alone?" Jake smiled and shook his head. Then he pointed to the buildings around them. Dawson's eyes flicked to the windows, the rooftops, the shadowed doorways. He saw the rifle barrels, the waiting faces. His expression shifted from confidence to calculation. 3 of his men were gone chasing false trails south. That left him with 3 others scattered around town, but now he was realizing those 3 were outnumbered and outpositioned. Lucy stepped into the street from her hiding place, a pistol in her hand. She moved to stand beside Jake, her face set and determined. Dawson's gaze shifted to her, then back to Jake. The bounty hunter's hand hovered near his gun, but he didn't draw. He was trapped and he knew it. The question was whether he was smart enough to recognize when he'd lost. Jake pulled the wanted poster from his vest pocket, the one offering $5,000 for his capture. He held it up so Dawson could see it clearly, then slowly tore it in half. Pieces fluttered to the ground between them. Jake's message was clear. The hunt was over. Dawson could leave or he could die, but he wasn't taking Jake Coleman anywhere. For a long moment, nothing happened. The street was frozen in time, everyone waiting to see what the bounty hunter would choose. Then Dawson's shoulders sagged slightly and his hand moved away from his gun. He'd made his calculation and decided $5,000 wasn't worth dying over. Not when facing an entire town that had decided to protect one of its own. The bounty hunter spoke again, his words lost to Jake, but probably some variation of "this isn't over" or "you'll regret this." Jake didn't need to hear the threat to understand it. Dawson was the type who'd carry a grudge to his grave. But he was also the type who knew when to fold a losing hand. He turned and walked back into the hotel. 5 minutes later, he emerged with his remaining 3 men. They mounted their horses without a word and rode north out of town, not looking back. Jake watched them go until they were just dust on the horizon. Then he turned to Lucy and saw her smiling, tears running down her face. The other townspeople emerged from their positions, cheering silently in Jake's world. The saloon owner clapped him on the back. The retired marshal gave him a crisp nod of respect. Pedro appeared and pulled both Jake and Lucy into a crushing hug. They'd done it. A handful of ordinary people had faced down professional killers and won through sheer determination and unity. Copper Ridge had defended one of its own, and in doing so had proven it was more than just a collection of buildings in the middle of nowhere. It was a community. It was home. That evening, the town gathered at the saloon for an impromptu celebration. Jake sat at a table with Lucy and Pedro, drinking beer he couldn't taste properly, but enjoying anyway. People kept coming over to shake his hand, to welcome him officially to Copper Ridge as if he hadn't been living there for months already. But he understood the gesture. Before today, he'd been a guest. Now he was family. Lucy wrote in the notebook they still used to communicate. "You stood your ground. You faced your fear. You trusted us to help you. I am proud of you, Jake Coleman. We all are." Jake read her words and felt something shift in his chest, some final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. For 5 years he'd been wandering, searching for something he couldn't name. He'd thought he was looking for a cure for his deafness, or maybe revenge against the cruel fate that had stolen his hearing. But what he'd really been searching for was much simpler. Acceptance. A place where silence didn't make him lesser. People who saw his worth beyond his disability. He'd found it in the last place he expected, in a small frontier town that barely rated a dot on most maps. But Copper Ridge had given him something cities full of people never could. It had given him purpose and belonging and the chance to be part of something larger than his own survival. Jake wrote his own message in the notebook, taking his time to get the words right. I spent 5 years believing I'd lost everything when I lost my hearing, but maybe I needed to lose that old life to find this new one. Maybe silence was not a curse, but a gift that taught me to see what really matters. Thank you for teaching me that. Thank you for giving me a reason to stop running and start living again. Lucy read his words, then passed the notebook to her father. Pedro read it too, his weathered face creasing into a smile. The blacksmith wrote his own message and showed it to Jake. A man's worth is not measured by what he has lost, but by what he chooses to do with what remains. You have much remaining, Jake. Use it well. The celebration continued late into the night, though Jake couldn't hear the music or laughter. He didn't need to. He could see the joy on faces around him, feel the warmth of community surrounding him like a blanket. This was what he'd been missing. This was what made life worth living even in silence. Eventually, Lucy walked him back to the small room he rented above the general store. At his door, she paused and wrote one final message for the night. Dawson may come back someday, or another bounty hunter will come. The poster still exists somewhere. Your past is not erased. Jake nodded. He knew this wasn't over forever. The murder charge in Kansas still hung over him like a storm cloud waiting to break, but he also knew he wouldn't face it alone anymore. Whatever came next, Copper Ridge would stand with him. That knowledge made all the difference. He wrote back to Lucy. Tomorrow I will send letters, find a lawyer, clear my name properly instead of just running. If I have a home worth protecting now, I need to make it safe to stay. No more hiding, no more running. Lucy's smile could have lit the entire street. She squeezed his hand and left him at his door. Jake watched her go, then went inside to his small room. He lit a lamp and sat at the tiny desk by the window. Outside, the town was settling into sleep. Inside, Jake began writing letters to lawyers in Kansas, to the family he defended from claim jumpers, asking them to testify on his behalf. To anyone who might help him prove his innocence. It would take time. Months, probably, maybe longer. Legal proceedings moved slowly on the frontier. But Jake had time now. He had a place to stay while the wheels of justice turned. He had people who believed in him, who'd stand by him through the process. Most importantly, he had something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. As dawn approached, Jake finished the last letter and sealed it carefully. He'd take them to the post office in the morning, start the long process of clearing his name. But tonight, he was content. For the first time in 5 years, he felt like he belonged somewhere. The silence that had once been his enemy had become his teacher, showing him that communication went deeper than words, that trust and loyalty and love were built on actions more than speeches. Jake Coleman had come to Copper Ridge running from his past, but he'd found something in the silent frontier that changed everything. He'd found people who saw him not as a disability to be pitied or a burden to be carried, but as a man with value and strength and worth. That belief had saved his life and given him a future. Now he just had to prove himself worthy of it. He extinguished the lamp and lay down on his narrow bed, watching the stars through his window. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The legal fight to clear his name. The daily work of building a real life in Copper Ridge. The constant vigilance required when you had enemies who might return. But tonight, Jake was at peace. Tonight, he was home. And in the silent darkness of his room, surrounded by the sleeping town that had chosen to protect him, Jake Coleman smiled. His world was quiet, but it was no longer empty. And that made all the difference between existing and truly living. The frontier had taken his hearing. But Copper Ridge had given him something far more valuable. It had given him hope. And hope, Jake was learning, was worth more than all the gold in California or all the voices in the world. Hope was what made tomorrow worth seeing. Hope was what turned a collection of buildings into a home. Hope was what transformed a scared, broken man into someone capable of standing his ground when it mattered most. As sleep claimed him, Jake's last thought was of Lucy's smile and Pedro's strong handshake, and the way the townspeople had stood with him against Dawson. These were the things worth fighting for. These were the things that made the silent frontier not just bearable, but beautiful. And tomorrow he'd wake up and keep fighting to deserve them. The end.